and this afternoon is Seeking the Face of God. I don't need to introduce Father Bowering. He's a very good friend of a number of us, an esteemed colleague, and really one of the more remarkable people in the field. So he's going to speak for 45 minutes, and then there will be a half hour for questions and answers.
Thank you, Jim, for this splendid introduction. I thank the academic community of Boston College that through Jim as the organizer has invited me, represented here by some of them colleagues, others students. And I will continue with that overarching theme of engaging Islam and follow more or less the outline that Jim already has given for these 6 lectures, and we'll focus a bit more on Islamic theology today, after having concentrated on Muhammad and the Quran last time. And I put the lecture under the title Seeking the Face of God, letting myself be inspired by a Quranic verse that says, "Aynama tuwallu fahuwa wajhullah." Wherever you look, there is the face of God. That is an understanding of the omnipresence of God, but also of an understanding of God that, to my mind, presents God as having a face but no back. Whenever you turn, you see the face of God. Wherever you turn, there it is. He's always there. And God is extremely present in the life of a Muslim. And that comes out also in the way in which its theology has developed. Islam is a monotheistic faith, and God is in the very center. Although in some form he remains a mystery, because the human intellect is not qualified enough to understand fully what that reality is in its full nature. But nevertheless, the theologians try to approximate this understanding by their descriptions of that reality. There are some other verses of the Quran that go along with that are often quoted in the theological treatises. "Laysa kamithlihi shay." There is nothing like unto him. That emphasizes more the mystery of God. And another one that is also quite typical for Islamic theology, it's another Quranic verse and a snippet only. I'm not going to bother you with many recitations, but I want to add that as well. And that is Kulla yawmin huwa fi sha'n. Every day, every moment, he is in action. God always is in action. And that is the understanding of Islam that Islam has about creation. God always creates at each and every moment. He does according to the Quran, he does the 6-day work of creation, but he doesn't sit back on the 7th day and look, I did this well. No, there is no Sabbath there. God is always active. And that is creation, therefore, is almost like, the best way to represent that is like when you watch a movie. It is different little frames, one next to the other, that give us the impression that there is total continuity. But in fact, it's discontinuous in nature underneath. And so it is with God's action in this world and towards his creation. He's active at each and every moment. And that represents from the start the deep dependence that the individual Muslim has on his relationship to God. The individual Muslim depends on God at each and every moment. And there is nothing that falls out of it. And that will have something to do with, as we go on, with the definition of human freedom, something with the definition of divine action. It also, or sometimes I may mention that as an aside, the question, what happens when there is a miracle? Well, that's the moment when God decides in his omnipotent wisdom not to just act like this, but to stop for a short time. And then you have a miracle. And then he continues on. So that it, and even the language that's used in Arabic for the miracle represents that break in action. But that's as much as an aside here. But the emphasis is, in Islamic theology, is very much on the dependence of God. And it goes back to the Quran itself, the Quranic message. But the Quran is not a treatise of theology. There are theological themes in there. Many theological themes then come out of a background that I described last time, that is not the pre-Islamic tribal religion of the polytheistic society, but it is an environment that already is informed by the themes of Judaism and Christianity, especially also of Christian theology. And that's already visible in the Quran itself. So the Islamic theology is founded on the Quran, and also founded on the Quran as in its belief as the Word of God, as its scripture. So it is a source for Islamic theology, obviously. But Islamic theology did not develop really as a field at the time of Muhammad. Muhammad was barely literate, probably illiterate. There were no theologians around, the first conquerors of Islam. They were interested in building an empire. They did not have any books with them on their camelback. What theology became took some time to develop. And so, in addition to, yes, the Quranic message itself that was with the Muslims from the very beginning, we had other influences on the origins of Islamic theology. One of them was the encounter with other religious traditions and other forms of theology in the process of this speedy development that Islam made in conquering the area that we call the Middle East today, and within a century of Muhammad standing in the heart of France and in the heart of India, and having established an empire that stretched over the eastern Mediterranean world and the lands behind them in a large way, and organizing a civilization that became the inheritor of the Mesopotamian culture and the civilization of Egypt, and the Iranian tradition and some part of the Indian world into Central Asia and so on. In that process of all these encounters with different religions, there were encounters especially also with Christian theology already established. And the Muslims obviously now had to find a way to express their own beliefs and their own ideas in theological terms in a theological system. They did not have to bring that from the desert. And what helped them in doing that very much was one movement that began about in 200 years after Muhammad's death, and that was they realized these other traditions, they have their system of theology. They possess this already. We don't. When they entered into discussion with them, they felt handicapped. These others, they already were organized, and they had it on the basis of the Greek system of philosophy. And so the caliphate, the caliph representing the community, set out to have a translation movement getting underway of translating the old Greek sources into Arabic, usually via Syriac, because Syriac was more related to Arabic, and it was easier to translate that way first, and the translators were at hand. With time, also translations were done directly from the Greek. But with that, they learned how to establish theology as a system. They had the principles of logic. They had what metaphysics available, and with that, they got into forms of discussion and building arguments, and were able to partially apologetically defending their own position and partially polemically attacking their opponents. And so what happened is that culturally they assimilated especially the methods of the other religious traditions, very deeply Christian traditions that were not uniform, that they had many sectarian developments at the time, and also of other cultures trying to establish the foundations in a system of theology that were the foundations for Islam as a monotheistic religion. And they were very clearly trying to guard themselves against any dualist influences from Iran, or influences also that they saw possibly as sort of entering into their concept of God as strictly monotheistic, and would therefore try to develop that system. So what helped them was really quite a comprehensive translation movement that went on, and that brought the terminology and the ideas, and especially the methods of other theological system, here mainly the Greek system, into their purview, and made it possible for them to use it to establish their own theological system of thought with time. That was one element. Another element that scholars believe influenced the origins of Islamic theology were the inner struggles that existed within the Muslim community early on, and where different groups claimed to be the true form of Islam and discarded other groups. And that internal struggle centered around the definition of who was a believer and who was an unbeliever, and how to establish in how far they were still members of the community. And that became a real struggle that was underlined by the murder of a caliph, which actually of more than one caliph. And the question presented itself: how can we define true membership in the community? What is the true legitimate leadership in the community? And definitely underlying it, it came to the question of how to define the grave sin, such as murder, and how sin had to be defined, and how it related to faith, and how faith related to works. Those were elements that came up directly out of the inner struggle of the early Muslim community. So there were influences that came from the Quranic message itself and its vision of God. There came the thirst for establishing an Islamic systematic theology that could stand up to rival doctrines that the Muslims encountered. And there were internal inner tensions within Islam that also favored the actual development of Islamic theology. Very soon, these theological attempts then, which came stage by stage, did not simply burst forth as a system, but it took time, developed into two major schools, the so-called Mu'tazila and the Ash'ariya, that became leading forms of theology. And the caliphs at first favored the Mu'tazili position and actually tried to establish control over the thought of the Muslim community by favoring that system and making it normative, and asking all other theologians to conform to their point of view. And however, that attempt by the caliphs often related to a period called its Inquisition, or its trial period, within the first half of the 9th century, did not succeed. The caliph did not get control over theology. Theology remained the domain of the scholars of theology, and they would continue to define what it was through their consensus, through the way in which they ultimately then agreed how theology should be presented, and that should not only be presented on the knowledge of drawn on the basis of Greek reason, but also on the basis of the Quranic revelation. Reason and revelation should both be included, and actually the tendency of the opposition to that Mu'tazila that the caliph originally protected and tried to organize came from the Ash'ariya. Ash'ari himself, first a follower of the Mu'tazila, and then turning away from them and moving away a little bit further from the reason side of Islamic theology to emphasizing the importance of revelation. And it is this Ash'ari system, together with another system derived from a person called Maturidi, that is parallel to this, that I leave this away. It becomes what is Islamic orthodoxy for the Sunni world. And I'm speaking here now only of the Sunni theology of the majority group of Islam. I leave the Shi'is aside for a special other lecture where I will turn towards the Shi'i point of view. And I stay basically with that community that represents throughout history about 80 to 90% of the Muslim world population throughout. So I'm basically here with the majority, and leave some other things aside with total respect to my Shiite colleagues. But to go back then to the issues that now came up in theology. They were taken, first of all, from the conception of God. God was seen as having attributes. Where do the attributes come from? They come from the names that are applied to him, names of praise, that he is all-seeing, all-hearing, omnipotent, omnipresent, that he raises people from the dead at the end of their life after they have died, that he is forgiving, that he's the just one, has mercy. All of these various elements that are mentioned in the Quran, and the Quran enumerates, at least traditionally, 99 names, those most beautiful names of God that are mentioned in the Quran. They were seen as his attributes, not as his name simply, but his qualities. And the question now came for the theologians: how can we define that? We want to maintain the concept of one God, but we have a plurality of attributes that are attributed to him, how to relate them. And so they adopted the solution of the divine essence and the attributes, and came up with different versions of that relationship. The Mu'tazila very much insisted on the oneness of God, and that these attributes would basically coincided with the one God, and should not be seen as something that belonged to him in any form, because that would go too much against the concept of oneness of God. Whereas the Ash'aris accepted the idea of attributes of God, that God does not know through his very essence, as the Mu'tazilis felt. No, God knows because he's knowing. And God sees because he's seeing. And they enumerated 7 special attributes of God, namely that God has life, he has power, he has will, he has knowledge, he's hearing, he's seeing, and he is speaking. Those were the 7 essential attributes of God. They were slightly different from other attributes, when, for instance, the attribute of God as creator, because they in themselves belonged to God, and they were not fully the same as God, as they said, but they were also not fully other than God, because if they're other than God, then you have division in God, and you don't have your monotheism any longer. And if they are fully identical with God, then there is the differentiation between them disappears. So they had to keep both, and they tell them, well, we fully don't know how. Our human intellect is too short to fully understand how that works in God, but that is what we have to affirm. So God knows through his attribute of knowing, and he sees through his attribute of seeing, and he speaks through his attribute of speaking. There will be some problem with the speaking in a moment. I will come to that. But so they understood God, therefore, in his richness through his attributes, but tried to maintain the full concept of the oneness of God. And these attributes were different from other attributes, namely when he is the creator, because creation is understood coming ex nihilo at some moment in time, and God is eternal. So God became creator, but since he is eternal, time did not affect him. But nevertheless, it's a type of attribute that has a relativity to the object that comes through it. That is not when God has life or has power or has will. But at the moment that he becomes creator, there is an object of his creation, namely the world of creation. That was a different type of attribute. It was also belonged to God and belonged to the concept of God, but it was slightly different from these very core attributes that the Ash'aris saw. That is to explain the structure of God. So the inner richness of God was explained through these attributes, with the attempt of maintaining the strict monotheistic view of God. This would then also go along with the Quran having militated against a Christian concept of Trinity that was misunderstood in the Quran, because it was a tritheism. It understood God the Father, Mary the Mother, and Jesus the Son, and militated against it. Even has Jesus himself speak up against it in the Quran. Muhammad did not understand the concept of Trinity as it was produced in Christian theology. There may have been some hidden phrases within the Quran itself where his informants may have brought that up to his mind, but he did not integrate this in any other form than in this nucleus family conception of God that the Christians had. He militated that Islam militated against that, and the polemics are very strong to safeguard the oneness of God from that point of view, and to emphasize the richness of God through the attributes and establish his reality in this particular fashion. There was one attribute that gave them some problems, and that is the attribute of his speaking, because the Quran is the speech of God. Now, the Quran how is this then? This is an eternal attribute. God was always speaking. His speaking was always with him. And here the Quran is the speech of God. How is that to be understood? The Mu'tazilis would say this is the divine speech created. And so they called the Quran created. But the majority and the orthodox view that imposed itself said the Quran is uncreated. It is the eternal speech of God. It is God's word, word for word. And that God's word, word for word belongs to God. It has no beginning and it has no end. It is in itself totally uncreated. And for the Quran, only the writing and the paper and that appears as human material. That can be accepted. But the word itself is the divine word itself. And God is the sole author of the Quran, and every word of him comes out in the exact way in which it appears in the Quran as his very word. And that became the watchword of the struggle between these Mu'tazila the Mu'tazila movement and the Ash'ariya. The Mu'tazila is created. The Quran is created, the divine speech appearing in created form for humanity. The Ash'ariya, however, this was God's very own word, would hang on to that concept. That was important for some particular type of questions that were connected with the speech of the Quran about God. And those are also clad in the terms of attributes, the so-called anthropomorphic attributes of God, where God is described as if he is a human person when the Quran speaks about God. Because the Quran speaks about God as having hands, and he has eyes, and he sits on a throne. When God is described in that way, he's described as almost as if he was a human being. Those attributes became a difficulty. When God says that, so the majority view is God says it, and because he says it, it is that way. He really sits on a throne. He really has hands, he really has eyes, because the divine speech said that. There is no correction of that. Whereas the Mu'tazilis, their opponents, said, no, you have to interpret that symbolically. He has hands because he's creator. He sits on the throne because he rules the universe. He has eyes because he sees everything, he's omniscient. That's what this means. That was not the form that carried the day. What carried the day was the respect of the revelation as the divine speech. And that each of those anthropomorphic attributes had to be taken in its literal way. That remains the orthodox view throughout, and the strong emphasis on the Quran that exists throughout Islamic theology until today. So we have had these issues surrounding first the attributes of God, and then we also have spoke about the nature of the Quran. I want to go the attributes of God in two categories: the eternal attributes, and they are slightly slightly different aspects of them, and then the aspect of the Quran as the Word of God. Now there is another problem that came with early theology that Muslims had to define, and that is the whole question of the relationship between divine predetermination and human freedom. That was a real clash there. The Mu'tazilis felt that the human being was given the power of making free choices. And there are Quranic verses that would support this position. But there are also many Quranic verses that would support the opposite tradition, namely that God determines for himself what is acting, and not the human freedom makes that decision. But the Mu'tazilis felt that God has given the human being a power, a potential to chose his own action. And according to his action, he will then also be rewarded by paradise or hell, depending on what type of action he performs when comes the last day of judgment. So the human being is fully responsible, and that gets very closely with the vision that Christian theology had. And perhaps the information of the Mu'tazila was also drawn more from, in the earliest stages of the development of Islamic philosophy, was perhaps more drawn from various Christian influences. But when we come to the Ash'aris, they did not like that, because they wanted to preserve that God does everything. And here comes that Quranic verse. He is in action at each and every moment. He's always there. There is nothing that happens without God being involved. And there cannot be a human actor that does something that's independent of God. That's impossible to. God is involved in it. So also God is involved in the action. That brought up the problem of good and evil, because human action can produce evil, not only good. So how is that to be understood? For the Mu'tazilis, it was very clear. God does everything. Whatever God does is good. He's good. He produces the good. The evil comes because of the human selection of freedom that does something that is positive, or is good, or is an evil action, and then will have to be punished. Here, the human being is at the decision-making position. Here, however, for the Ash'aris, this was not. To maintain that oneness of God, God could not have any rival of action. The human being could not have its independent action, and therefore God did not only will the good but also the evil, because everything comes from God. Nevertheless, in order to understand that it is ultimately the human being that has to be punished for the evil action and not God, or rewarded for the good action that he performs, they constructed a system where they came to the edge of understanding of things, namely that there is something like the acquisition of a divine act, that God does everything, but at the very last moment of a particular action, he gives the human being the potential to do this very act, which is his act. And they called that, therefore, there is a concursus between God and the actor that tries to explain that evil action comes into reality, but God is not the one who actually causes this. And why does the human and what is the emphasis on the punishment of the human being for an evil action comes out of the understanding that God gives commandments and interdictions. And according to these commandments and interdictions, the individual has to construct his life. So the individual does not necessarily work in the first place on the basis of his or her own conscience, on the basis of the nature of things, but on the basis that God has given commandments of do this and don't do that. And when the human being in his or her action goes against the commandment or the interdiction, then it will be the human being will be rewarded or punished in eternal life at the day of resurrection, at the day of judgment, when everybody will be called to give account for his or her life. So that was a discussion that went deep into the origins of Islam, the question of the relationship of the attributes and God, the relationship of the human freedom and divine omnipotence, and how to bring those two together, and the question of the nature of the Quran. This became very much the core of Islamic theology, where it's developed towards the Ash'ari concept, namely of the uncreated Quran, of the emphasis shifting more to the divine action as overpowering every human action, being the actual action of each and every moment, and also of the God having these attributes, but these attributes not creating anything that would bring the concept of division into the concept of the monotheistic God. These were the struggles that the early Muslim theologians had to struggle with, and they would build their theological treatise on those as time went on. That was something that was something that went very much into the schools of theology. Most Muslim scholars that have had control over society in Islam are the scholars that define Islamic law, not so much the scholars that define Islamic theology. But these theological issues got at the very core to defend Islam as monotheistic religion against other religious orientations and theologies that existed at that time and were already in place. This type of theological understanding of God ran into some problems with Muslims who felt that they had an intimate relationship to God. They had a personal experience of God in their prayer life. And that they understood that these theologians, they have their own way of establishing their system. But they also felt that the theologians created a gulf between God and the human being. That there was no mediation between the two. God was totally different. He was the ultimate mystery. The human being was the creature. He was the creator. How to bridge that gulf between creature and creator? How to come about experiences that individual Muslims had, namely of the proximity, of the nearness of God, that they could reach God in their prayer, that they felt that He was omnipresent and omniscient of whatever they did, and that they had a relationship to God. And in prayer they were addressing someone that was really there. And how could they relate this type of experience with these theological systems with the theological system as it developed, that emphasized so much that chasm that existed between the creator and the creatures, and that God was so totally different from them. And that here we come into the area where there is an inner mystical development within Islam, where a type of a mystical theology develops, where individuals emphasize that they have experiences of union with God. They actually experience themselves as becoming one with God. For them it was no longer important to profess God is one. The Muslim profession of faith is God is one, la ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah. That was the profession of faith. They said it's not enough that you profess God as one. You have to experience God as one, or as being one with God. And they used the very same term for union with God. So they switched from simply looking at God as professed as one, but to say actually this becoming one is rooted in our experience of God, and that experience of God creates a psychological union with Him. Our experience is that we are one with God. We can reach that. In order to reach that, they developed exercises of asceticism to purify themselves, to be ready for the divine presence to receive. They used meditations, mainly of Quranic themes, but also of other themes, to prepare themselves for such experiences. They felt that they could develop a deep trust in God in their own lives because they experienced Him as being near to them. Because wherever there is the face of God, He's always there. And so they knew in their heart that they could be one with God, and they had that experience. And that was something that the theologians felt, aha, here now we come into an area where these two levels of the divine otherness and the human creature concept become somewhat intermingled. And that affects the oneness of God and our monotheistic creed. they persecuted that tendency. But the tendency went even further. They also developed their own theoreticians. And this more mystical movement of Islam that came to that experience of God, and that includes a lot of struggles and internal preparation over time. And that idea then became one step further. Namely, where there would be someone say, if we experience oneness with God, we can experience only oneness with God if we are one with God. That there is an ontological basis underneath the experiential basis. It's not only that we say it's to profess God with words. That's easy. Experience Him with one. That's the real life. But now, if you experience Him with one, think about it. There has to be underneath a oneness between you and God. And here now you come to the real extreme of what the theologians have developed, namely of that total otherness of God. Now the two became one. And they were typically two different aspects of the very same reality. And there were theologians that saw, therefore, only one existence there that had two aspects: the divine aspect of the divine reality and the human aspect of the created reality. And it was only possible to experience this deep felt oneness with God if there was underlying it a union or an ontological oneness with God in the philosophy. And that obviously created a lot of tensions between those that had developed the structural philosophy of the theology of Islam, with those that felt that they had to maintain an inner religious experience and think, reflect on it, and realize that that experience of oneness with God was only possible if there was actual unity with God on the level of being. That very often then philosophically would lead to conceptions where the idea of creation was abandoned for the idea of emanation. I may come back to that when we go into philosophy rather than adding this now. But it became something that became a point of extreme friction within the Muslim society in how to defend the understanding of God. This movement is mainly known as the Sufi movement, the mystics of Islam that developed that. I could give you names of authors that represent the background of it. It was a movement that developed very in different areas of the Muslim world at first, before it became identified as a movement, and then had its own representatives that became that brought out more the philosophical expression of that oneness with God as it is experienced, and then as it is rooted in a oneness with God on the level of reality. These were struggles that were in theology were very much emphasizing the position of God and the experience of God, and how God had to be understood as the center of Islamic theology, including the aspects that I have mentioned. Obviously, Islamic theology had other aspects as well. It had the aspect of the final judgment, of life beyond death, the description of paradise and hell as the reward or the punishment of the individual. It had to deal with the divine justice and mercy. How those two sides of God to be weighed against one another? How is God to be seen on the one side in His majesty, and on the other side in His beauty? And so different categories of how to look at God and what to expect from God were added to the discussion. As was also the question of other aspects that were rooted in Islamic, in the core of Islamic theology, and that was the concept of the prophet, and the history of the prophets as they had come through, according to the Quranic basis, since Adam all the way to Muhammad, and how God had come and brought through the prophets scriptures, and how those scriptures were admonitions of the prophets for humanity that had come stage by stage, where Abraham played a central role, but where also Moses and Jesus were mentioned since the Quran, and that was adopted. In the process of that, we had controversies in discussing these prophets. There was the attempt to maintain that the prophet Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. As you seal an envelope, he is the last of the prophets. And therefore, his message is basically overshadows all the others, because the followers of the earlier religions had so tampered with their scriptures, and only the Quran would then represent the true and ultimate message for humanity. And that also meant that each and every Muslim felt that he or she had the responsibility to spread the knowledge of Islam and the adherence to the Quran until the day of judgment for all of humanity. And so there came out the universal missionary thrust of Islam that exists within the heart of each and every Muslim until today, that ultimately there is that deep conviction that Islam will impose itself in the way in which the Prophet had proclaimed it in the Quran and had laid the basis for the human order until Judgment Day. There were other aspects that Islamic theology developed, not only that of the prophets, but also that of angels, that there were angels, they adopted angels, that angels were seen as surrounding the throne of God, and that, but with time, their function in Islamic theology disappeared somewhat in the discussion of the attributes, and Muslims still will continue to accept that there were scriptures to other prophets that they accept as the basis of that were other religions, but the understanding of these other scriptures that came to the relevant prophets came directly down to them from God as the Quran came down. And the fact that they do not fully agree in content is not true that there's some misunderstanding on the part of Muhammad, but the discrepancies came in because the followers of those religions tampered with their texts, and therefore those texts do no longer exist with one another. These are some of the side aspects that also entered into the consideration of Islamic theology, where the theology itself was centered on the concept of God, his attributes, the question of human freedom and predestination, as well as on the nature of the Quran as the basis of Islamic theology. And then the challenge that came through those that entered into the Islamic theology more from the mystical side, that would be more the core of it. I just wanted to add another aspect that has slipped my mind at the moment, that it's gone. The Islamic theology has maintained throughout history that strong monotheism that is, and here the thought comes back, that is very central to it. The thought was more of a type of a personal approach that I have in terms of how do I see Muhammad as a prophet when I look at the Quran from a Christian perspective. I can read the Quran as a Christian, as a Muslim can read it as a Muslim. A Muslim may not like this, perhaps may have asked me why should I enter into the Quran. But I say the Quran collects material that is taken from the Christian tradition, and Muhammad, through oral information, received that. So when I look at that, and I see Muhammad in that process more in similarity, and that is very risque when I say that, and not many scholars will agree with this. I see him more in the way, from a Christian perspective, the way Paul acted towards the Greco-Roman world and the Hellenistic tradition. He also he went to rabbi school. He was literate. He knew Greek. proclaimed the message of Christianity in Greek, but he relied on the oral information that he received from the circle of the disciples about Jesus. He never met him except in a vision. And he had to proclaim, he felt that this was his charge, to proclaim the mission to the Christian mission to the Gentiles, to those that did not belong to the inner Jewish circle of society in the Mediterranean world, but to the Hellenistic society, to the Gentiles. And therefore he adjusted that message to the parameters of that other tradition that was originally not the core tradition in the environment in which the Christian message was proclaimed by Jesus himself. Muhammad had to face the Arab tradition, but he did not face the early circle of Jesus' disciples. He got the message as it had been filtered to him through different sectarian developments in a very heterogeneous way of what Christianity really was. And he only understood certain aspects of it and others not, because they were never presented to him. But he had the same type of method of applying himself to that Arab environment to which he belonged and where he knew the language, to insert this, the religious experience that he had found in his own prophetical vision of things, and therefore proclaimed it. And here comes my Christian reading of the Quran in it that will be controversial, namely that the elements of Christianity that are hidden in the Quran and not always very clearly defined in exactly the language in which we know it, they are still there and coming out in the Quran itself. And they give a life to that source and can be detected and can be found. And therefore, I think when in the next step, and it now becomes perhaps even more controversial, when we speak about dialogue, what we really did for the last 5 centuries or so, we sent missionaries out into the world to convert people in the Americas, in Africa, in India, in China, in the Asian world. And we did enormous efforts to bring those people the Christian message. Now, through the availability of our knowledge of other religious traditions, in my case especially Islam, we have lost that fervor. We have the data right at hand, and we hardly really study those other religions and their documents from an inner drive of reabsorbing or bringing to light what is rooted there, and gave a live stream to the appearance of the Quran in my case. That we have not had that grip about other religions, and we get overviews of other religions, but we do not engage them. And I think that is a bit of the challenge that will come towards us into the second half of this century, inshallah.
So this is a time for questions and comments. Yes.
Thank you very much for a really illuminating lecture. I just have a very brief question out of curiosity. At the beginning you said that the Islamic God doesn't have a back, that it's only face.
Yes.
But you didn't really elaborate very much on that remark. So I was wondering if there is more to it. Also by comparison
The
to other.
Quran does not say that God does not have a back. The Quran only said wherever you turn there is the face of God.
Yeah.
Yes. And that is to say, and that goes together with God is in action at each and every moment. So there is nothing that escapes your relationship to God, because it's always with you. And God is with the human being there at each and every moment. That is what is there. That I said he has not a back was to emphasize that he's being turned to humanity at all times.
Okay.
That relationship always exists. And and that also means that, at least for me, that ultimately God does not turn away from the sinner.
Yeah.
The sinner turns away from God. But God does not show his back to the sinner. He's always there, he's always in relationship. Yeah.
Isn't that true of Christianity and
That's
Judaism
also
as
true.
well?
That's why I say there are races, there are traces of Christian spirituality that are encapsulated in the Quran that very often are not necessarily recognized or cannot be put together as a system of thought, because Christianity was not adopted as an established system by Muhammad. It was not known to him in its creed as such. It was only known in the oral information he got from a great variety of informants. And those informants very often were not trained theologians at all.
Andrea?
Thank you very much for your brilliant lecture. I have two questions. The first one, you mentioned a series of topics that are studied by Islamic theology. What about theological disciplines like systematics and, they say, eschatology? Or if you can help us to see if those topics have helped in structuring disciplines or not. And the second question is about theodicy. What about suffering, diseases? How do we understand in Islamic theology the fact that there is suffering, or let's say natural disasters? How do we understand God's action, God's creation? There is something that is harder to understand.
Yes, I mean, there are, eschatology exists as a circle of questions within Islamic theology, and it's one of its 5 points of faith that is discussed in theological treatises. So it is part of it. I don't see it as a separate, perhaps, line of theology. I don't think in their madrasas they would have a professor of eschatology in particular, but it is definitely part of the system. With regard to your question about the suffering, it is whatever happens because it comes from God, and also the suffering comes from God. And the Muslim will first relate himself, will see that this is coming from God, will not blame God, but that is what was the divine will. And he has to accept the divine will as it stands. He can entreat God to do him better, but ultimately that comes from God. And this dependence on God is so deep that even in normal speech, when you receive something of a good action from a neighbor, you in the first place give thanks to God. Even in a way, it was his obligation to do it, because he got it from God and he could give it to me. And so I say, thank you for God for doing this for me, although it comes from another source. It's not the horizontal direction in the first place, it's the vertical direction, dependence on God. And that is also with the suffering. The suffering comes from God. The good and evil is there, has to be accepted as a reality. It is willed by God in the majority of because it cannot come up next to his will. And the will has to be accepted, even if it brings suffering. And Islam does not have the mediator figure that Christianity has. Islam does not speak about incarnation. Islam does not speak about redemption. Yeah, I mean, the Quran denies Jesus' death on the cross. The foundations for these concepts are not in the Quran, in the Muslim message. It has to come to terms with the fact that what happens to me is what God wanted to happen. And I have to accept that suffering. I don't know his ultimate will and his ultimate plan about me. I have to live in obedience to him. I can utter my prayer to him. I can ask for relief, but it is the divine will that will happen. I cannot question that.
You talked about the many themes coming from Christianity into Islam and elaborate on them. What about Judaism?
Especially on the time of...
And specifically, would it be fair to say that the more legalistic emphases within Islam and Islamic theology come from Judaism?
Yes.
Do you believe that
when we come to Islamic law, I will emphasize that. There the Jewish influence is very strong. The Jewish influence in Medina for Muhammad is also very strong from the Jewish side. There are many Jewish elements that are integrated into the Quran, and especially into its legal thought and legal procedures and legal methodology. There is quite some influence. Though I think the earlier encounter of Muhammad with Christianity may also not have been, because it was so heterogeneous, may also have some element of Jewish Christianity, a Christian form as that continued more in the earlier Jewish tradition than in the Pauline tradition that came perhaps slightly later. How that is historically connected is difficult to understand. But yes, Judaism has a strong influence, especially on the monotheism. That is where Judaism, and even when you have the Quranic term of oneness, the Arabic switches almost to translate the Hebrew for one in Surah Al-Ikhlas. Yeah? Qul huwa Allahu ahad. The ahad is the echad. Allahu samad lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad. Again, ahad. Yeah, there is influence there that Muhammad absorbs, and the figure of Moses being so important in the Quran, and the many aspects, especially taken from the Book of Genesis or Book of Jubilee, whatever appear in the Quran, go back to Hebrew Bible topics that come out of the Jewish tradition. Whether they are all directly transmitted from Jews or mediated by Christians as well, that is more difficult to say. But the Jewish element is very strong. Yes. Perhaps today is Yom Kippur, so we can. It has to be honored. I thought I would go into that more when we come to Islamic law, because there the emphasis is stronger.
David?
Why, in your opinion, did the Mu'tazilites lose? That is,
they lost because the Caliph wanted to establish their authority and their thought, their vision of things, which to us looks more in the way we look at things, wanted to impose it as something like the state creed, through edict. And that was one element that was resented by the majority who wanted to, and the other element was it was very strongly based on reason, without giving enough weight to revelation. And the large following of the Muslim community was not able to reach that level of refined reasoning that depended on translations from the Greek sources that were open only to those that were really steeped in that tradition. So, because I think it was in part it was an elite movement that did not penetrate down to become a popular movement. It had a more strong basis on the reason disregarding the element of revelation. And it was imposed by the Caliph, who himself wanted to get control over a state creed that he could control, and that the scholars of the theology did not want him to do. And therefore there's this opposition. And it did not succeed, even though for a period of time he tried to enforce it. The Caliph did not get control over Islamic thought, and the Caliph did not get control over Islamic law. Over military events is something else. Yeah, that is, these were some reasons why the Mu'tazilis did not succeed.
Catherine?
Given that Christian theology continued to develop after this period, are there any things that you see that Christianity has borrowed or learned from Islam rather than the other way around?
I think Christianity has not learned much from Islam. I think Islam has more learned from Christianity in many ways, from the Christian tradition than the other way around. But what I was trying to perhaps suggest that we can rediscover where common roots between Christianity and Islam are hidden within its scripture or its tradition, by focusing more our study on those crucial texts or sources that are essential for the understanding of Islam. That is more the direction that I think we should be going. The Muslims are people that have a very strong faith. It is impressive. And we sometimes can learn from that. We can learn from their trust in God that they develop within their own life. I am not saying that we should ditch our theology as such, but we should open up to various explanations and not stick perhaps too much to a solid core that we only say that there are no edges to it, there are no openings there. At least is how it affects me. I know that many others will shy away from that, but it is a reality that we have to live with, that you will have a growing Muslim world population that is not to recede, and it's very close to us now, and we have so many things that we have in common. Because we have them in common and they are so close to us, we don't see the contours any longer because Islam is too close to our vision. And so I think that we have rubbed shoulders with Islam throughout history. And Islam has taken over areas that were formerly totally Christian. And Islam never receded from those areas. Whereas Christianity went into some other areas. But there where Islam implanted itself on earlier Christian territory, it basically has taken control. Yes, we have still some minority religions in the Middle East, but those are only traces of what once was there. So, and I don't see any that Islam has come up with, and there's also probably some people will challenge me on that, with something really new about religion. Monotheism was known from Judaism. It was, yes, it was in Christianity. That the Trinity does not take anything away from monotheism in the Christian point of view. Muslims understand it does. But the idea of life beyond death was definitely there through Christianity. Resurrection was there, ultimate judgment. Those are not ideas that Muhammad has all of a sudden discovered that no other religious leader had known before or mentioned before. Whatever the theme, the basic themes and the important themes are that are in the Quran were already there. And Islam itself says, we are the religion that was the original religion that God meant already since Adam's time and was definitely there already in Abraham. And we are only bringing this really back because mankind has slipped off where it should go over a period of time. There is, in a way, Islam sees itself, it doesn't bring anything new. But it brings that was always known, but had been forgotten and should be brought up again. So there is, I think that there are in Islam there are roots where we do not fully see the commonness because we are so close to it, and also especially in the modern phase, we see so much of a minority within Islam emphasizing very much its militancy and whatever goes with that. I will get to deal with that in next semester, not now. So we have a sort of hesitancy with regard to that whole system. I mean, this is something, well, we'll rather keep it away rather than engage it.
So this Catholic view and your...
This is just a short follow-up question. How do you see then the relationship between Avicenna, Averroes, and Aquinas in the Middle Ages if there's no sort of...
I don't see Avicenna as a theologian, Ibn Sina, nor do I see Averroes as a theologian. I see them as philosophers. Their philosophical works were translated into Latin in medieval times, in the 12th, 13th century, and became a good part of the foundation for the scholastic theology that developed through Thomas Aquinas and others. They bring something to, and I think Thomas Aquinas did not go and engage the Quran. He engaged Averroes and Avicenna or Al-Ghazali or such characters that came out of the, and in the process, the Western tradition rediscovered its Greek sources through the Latin translation of the Arabic. But I see this really more as a development of Islamic philosophy, and Islamic philosophy develops totally separate from Islamic theology. Islamic philosophy does not take into account revelation. It only is based on human reason and tries to continue the direction of Greek philosophy as it stands. And the early Muslim philosophers have Christian students or Christian teachers and the other way around. That is a philosophical development that disregards the role of revelation and tries to structure the origin of the universe or on the question of cause and caused, on the ultimate causer. For most philosophers, it is the question is that of emanation, not of creation. That everything comes out of the original source. I will come back to that when I speak about Islamic philosophy. So I don't see these two individuals, Ibn Sina and Averroes, as or others of their nature, like Farabi, who he wrote his dissertation on. That is something that is not really the province of Islamic theology. And so but they obviously are involved in the translation movement. They are based on the material that became available to the Muslim community through the translations. But those translations were made in the first place because the Caliph wanted to have the Greek tradition also with regard to its medical knowledge. He was interested in having good physicians at court and wanted to know what was in that Greek tradition, because the Greek tradition at the time, and the professor will probably correct me in some form, did not make a clear distinction between natural sciences and humanities and social sciences as we do today, but it was one curriculum of the academy. And very many of those who were philosophers also were knowledgeable in medicine. And therefore, the science and philosophy were somewhat united in that curriculum. And that is a different question, I think, that it should not be put together with Islamic theology. With Ghazali, you have a beginning of a change there and a challenge of philosophy in his refutation of the philosophers, where there is a move by that time then away from that more Aristotelian-based philosophy as such, and the drawing in of revelation into the consideration. But then Ghazali, some will no longer see him as purely belonging to philosophy, but as moving over into more of explaining the religious scenario of Islam in more mystical or theological terms. There was someone among you studying Ghazali.
Michael in the back.
Yes, back, yes. So he maybe elucidate this even further.
Bernard.
I would like to ask a question about the written sources of the Mutazilim movement. Are these sources present in today's, in the contemporary theological debates? Because I think they are important for the question of Quran hermeneutics.
Yes. The Mu'tazili sources, in as much as I am informed about them, very few of them exist as such, as they were authored in the beginning. They are more found within the representations of a literature base called Islamic hagiography, where their points of views are mentioned. There is a 6-volume work by Van Es, by Joseph Van Es, about the Islamic theology in the 8th and 9th century, and where he brings up many of these authors of the Mu'tazilis, but cannot rely on substantial texts that they themselves have composed, but rather has to go back to how they are quoted in later sources. So to get to and the Mu'tazilis in the beginning did not have the opponents of the Ash'aris to defend themselves against their objection, because the Ash'aris didn't exist yet. Ash'ari was a Mu'tazili who upon a vision decided to abandon Mu'tazili ideas, but keep their methodology and draw it over into the reaction against the Mu'tazilis. So there we are hampered by source material that is not as that perhaps even in the beginning was never thought to be methodologically presented that way in view of a possible later attack or that was still forthcoming and not known at the time. Shi'i theology has adopted some of the Mu'tazili principles into its presentation. And Shi'i works are quite widely acceptable, but there comes an interpretation that is not simply taking over Mu'tazili theology as such. But if you want to read the Mughni of Abdul Jabbar, that is usually understood as a Shi'i source of theology that has a strong dose of Mu'tazili doctrine included in it. It's 14 volumes. That is one of the major sources that is available for the Mu'tazili tradition. Yeah, and Shi'ism has then developed its own sources in connection with that. But it is a later source. It does not go to the origins of the Mu'tazila, the Mughni of Abdul Jabbar.
Two more questions, one here, and then, okay, Michael.
So I have one short comment and one comment question. First, about the relationship between Christianity and Islam and the way that Islam borrows from Christianity, and it is a fact that the stories are available, and this is a nature of language that, or not nature of culture, that it doesn't come out of ex nihilo, it just comes out of the place that is in use. But a peculiar fact about the Quran is that it doesn't have a single complete story of a prophet. It's only the only complete story is the story of Joseph, that is completely symbolic and not historical at all. So it's not, if borrowing your term about miracle, I want to say, can we say that it is Islam comes as an interruption to, as a miracle, as an interruption to the stories that are already in place, not to say that, okay, this was the history of revelation. No, it's that pick and choose how we make sense, and this is, I think, the way we Christian might be able to read it more fruitfully, as to see how we can make sense out of a history as history in terms of different. So in the Quran, we have a theme in a surah, and then in a chapter, and then we in terms of that chapter, in terms of the theme, we just pick and choose selectively the ones that are suitable for that. So as an interruption, I think this is another.
Originally, the Quran is being put together by piecemeal elements in the proclamation of Muhammad. Muhammad did not relate whole surahs at length, but the Muslim tradition is very strong about that, and the whole appearance of the Quran is that it's a motley assemblage of piecemeal proclamations that were put together. In the case of Surah 12, this the story of Joseph of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, that there is a consecutive narrative of that. It is at variance with the representation in the book of Genesis, but that more or less follows that theme through and nothing else. That is unique in the Quran. There is probably, for my perception of it, there is a moment of redaction that had advanced further than in other areas when the Quran was put together. When the Quran was put together on the basis of end rhyme, because it was all rhyme prose. And those that put the things together simply wanted to catch everything into what the proclamations were, going back to the prophet as known as the Quran. And therefore you have this differentiation. But that has nothing to do with the miracle. That has something to do with the origin of the Quran as it came about, and the composition of the Quran 20 years after Muhammad's death, where people that gathered the material most likely also had some activity of redactors to the whole, but did not want to lose any piece of what belonged to the Quranic message, and had no idea of establishing a foundation of a scripture for another religion. They wanted to have it together, so to present that material as in one source.
Yeah, but my point was not a chapter that is related to, but even the story of Moses, for example, comes like a sentence in the middle of just remember Moses did this too, you know. It's not telling the story. It's obvious that it's an interruption of the story. It's an interruption of storytelling for another purpose, and that's my viewpoint. But my question is that in view of whatever you said here, Mu'tazili and Ash'ari, Al-Ghazali at some point in his Ta'afud wants to gives several reasons why Ibn Sina is heretic and should be put to death. I mean, they are so diverged and they are so different that how can, and my question is, how can we ever think about an ideology based on Islamic theology when we have completely different, you know, two different poles? This guy says that guy is heretic, you know. How could we even come up with some kind of ideology?
You have the same thing in Christianity?
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds very Christian to me. It sounds like the Christian dilemma we have.
That's my point. So there is no, that's my point.
We
There
have
is no
Christian-
ideological foundation, because in Christianity we have, especially in Catholicism, we have church and we have pope. But in Islam there is absolutely no dogma. Dogma comes as a consensus, and we have two words. One is ijtihad and one is ihtiyat. Ijtihad, just see which ones, try to see if you can make sense of it. So if not, and ihtiyat, if you couldn't make sense of a problem, just do as you wish, kind of thing. You know, as you just be heedful and respectful and see. So there is no dogma. That's my point.
There is no teaching authority in Islam that is in one man. There is no normative council in Islam that establishes, but there is consensus. Yes, that the basis for Islamic thought is the Quran, Muhammad's own comportment and tradition, and then the consensus of the community as validated by the scholars. And that works its way out mainly, I think, through practice, as it is practiced and then accepted, and over time. There is, and that is something that can evolve in some stages when new ideas come into Islam and are included into that consensus through methods like ijtihad that you mentioned, or qiyas is another term for it. But that is a system that does not go back to the authoritative teaching authority, except when you go to Shiism, where the Imam has a teaching authority that is different from that of Sunnism. But in Sunnism itself, it is the consensus of the community, represented by the consensus of the scholars, that establishes what is dogma. And there is dogma in Islam, not all pronounced by one particular source, but worked out over the vicissitudes of time by the community through its representatives, who are the theologians.
On that, I know that Dan and Michael had their hands up, but you've been taking questions now for 40 minutes, and I think we want to say thank you.
Thank you.